Genascence is looking to lead a renaissance in gene therapy, taking it from high-dollar antidote in rare disease to an accessible approach to treating common conditions like osteoarthritis. Dr. Tom Chalberg is leading the charge. I'm Ben Comer.
And I'm Matt Pillar.
And this is the Business of Biotech, JP Morgan 2025 edition. And we're here in San Francisco with Dr. Chalberg to learn about his role in driving gene therapy from the stuff of academic research centers to a doctor's office near you.
Dr. Chalberg, it's super nice to have you. I appreciate the time you're taking out of your very busy week here in San Francisco to spend with us.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here and looking forward to the show.
The pleasure's all ours. So as we do, we start with some background on you, on our guest. And you earned your Ph.D. in cancer biology, genetics, and ophthalmology, and went pretty directly, it appears, into pharma marketing and commercial operations at Genentech. So I'm curious, when you were coming out of academia with those degrees, was pharma immediately on your radar, or was it an opportunistic move? How did you end up working in pharma?
So it's a great question. Thinking back, I was a graduate student really in the early 2000s, and when you think back to that period, it was really right around the time the human genome had been sequenced. And I thought, what an amazing opportunity to be able to go back to school and learn about, genetics and basic science. But I was really always interested in genetic medicines and the idea that, we could use this new knowledge in genetics and in molecular biology to treat human diseases. And so at the time, I joined a lab that was really, more than basic science. It was interested in the applications of, gene therapy. And in this case, it was really a kind of an early form of gene editing in order to, help, sort of technology assessment and technology development in preclinical models of disease. And so I was really always interested in, even when I was in grad school, in how do we use this technology to bring forward improvements to human health. And, I was actually a Howard Hughes Fellow, and that was part of his vision of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, was how do we always think about furthering human health. And so when I was looking for a job, Genentech was, absolutely one of the greatest places to work, and it was growing massively at the time. This was back in 2005. And I started in commercial operations and then marketing because I really wanted to learn about the business of biotech and sort of how does that end of the spectrum, exist in sort of really being the endpoint for what we all do now as development stage biotechs, is to kind of bring forward medicines to make them available to patients who have, big unmet needs and help them live better lives.
Was that interest in the business side of biotech, was there a little seed in the back of your head from day one that said, I'm going to be a biotech builder one day? What that was the means to what end?
Perhaps not. Perhaps there was always, something, germinating, but certainly not that I was aware of. I was, despite being in Silicon Valley, in the early 2000s, and I think, maybe now I would say entrepreneurial by nature, but I certainly didn't know that at the time. I was, definitely enjoying, big company life. And it was really, just an opportunity that came by that said something that I had worked on and been close to at grad school, started to form the ideas of a company. And so together with, some great mentors and co-founders, we decided to kind of have a go at it. And, if you think back, that was actually 2008. And if you remember 2008, it was a very difficult time to raise money.
And this was Avalanche?
This was for Avalanche, that's right.
Yeah.
So it was 2008, 2009, 2010. I was still at Genentech, but we were starting to, form the ideas that then became Avalanche. And finally I left in 2010 to do that full time.
But yes, 2008, not a good time to launch anything.
Yeah, in a sense, it was a great time to start, and in a sense, it was a bad time to start. It was a bad time to start because no one was deploying capital at all during the the global financial crisis of 2008, 2010. No companies were getting funding, let alone early stage biotech, let alone gene therapy, for kind of any indications. And but at the same time, I think during these down cycles are really times when you can think about innovation, in a more quiet way. You don't have, very well-funded competitors that are, trying to outpace you. And as an entrepreneur, I think often we have to think about, where's the puck going? How do you, not imagine what everybody knows is going to be great today, because it's really hard to outcompete, companies that are more well-resourced. But, what is going to be possible in 3, 4, 5 years, and how can we start working on that now, so that once the rest of the investor community and world takes notice, we've made some progress and have some kind of already head start and advantage basically over a well-funded competitor.
That's a difficult thing to do. I mean, what kind of tea leaves do you look at to anticipate where you want to be in 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, and one that entrepreneurs, really spend a lot of time thinking about. And, when you think about the kind of the investment cycles, there are things that are hot and there are things that are not, right? Rare disease will come in and out of fashion, or, CNS, or, now immunology is a buzzword. I&I, immunology and inflammation, is something people spend a lot of time on. CAR-Ts were hot for a while. Immuno-oncology, everybody remembers that wave. And despite these sort of waves of enthusiasm in the investment community, the progress on these technologies is pretty much steady and linear over time, because academics get grants and they create new discoveries and they publish papers, and you can sort of see this progression in the field. And so if you're paying close attention to kind of what's happening at the fundamental science level, then perhaps you're interested in something before the field is. And I think that's where entrepreneurs spend a lot of time and kind of think about, okay, this has come a long way, but nobody's noticed it yet. What's the overlooked area that we can capitalize on with this? And sometimes I think you're right, and sometimes of course you're wrong, but in the end, that's part of where entrepreneurs can fit in the ecosystem, is sort of in this area, sort of before the big, well-funded competitors take notice.
It's interesting that in order to have sight of that, it occurs to me that being in the academic community is advantageous, but not all folks in the academic community have the entrepreneurship angle or bug or desire, right? So it's a sort of a catch there.
I think that's right. I mean, academics are terrific at innovating, right? They're extremely creative, and they have a lot of time to sort of think and trial new things as part of the, of having a setup already in an academic lab, and having some grants and having some, skilled labor, sitting around looking for new projects. And, some academics are terrific entrepreneurs and start many, many companies, and they start all of their own projects. And some would rather, stay in academic labs and sort of let the technology licensing offices, prosecute the opportunity. So I think you see, a huge variation across the board. But, as someone who, developed this interest in entrepreneurship, there's certainly opportunities if you look for them, where exactly as you say, there's, projects and discoveries that are, waiting for, because universities don't sell things, right? They don't manufacture and sell drugs. And so there's, of course, always a handoff to industry at some point in the process.
Was it something that you had to nurture in yourself, the entrepreneurial piece, or did it come naturally, like you recognized it as something you wanted to do and just look for opportunities?
It's interesting. I mean, I remember leaving Genentech in 2010 and starting Avalanche. And I was the first full-time employee, and sort of thinking about, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next week? How am I going to, what's going to happen in quarter 2? Where are we going to be a year from now? And just sort of being filled with this uncertainty around the future, right? And sort of, oh my gosh, where's our next funding going to come from? We don't know what the data are going to say. And having, grown up and spending your time in school, where you really have quite a lot of control over, your whatever next grades, your project in grad school, your project at work, where you kind of have a pretty clear idea of the progression of your career and so on. And I could certainly see that had I stayed at Genentech. That it was so different being an entrepreneur, and sort of the stress of that is actually quite real and quite significant. But then sort of realizing that, when you step back and take a moment of like, this is why we're here. This is why entrepreneurs are doing what they're doing, because it's risky, because it's uncertain, and sort of letting that, wash over you and drowning in the uncertainty of the position, and going from there to, okay, we don't know what tomorrow's going to look like. We're just going to make good decisions along the way and follow the data and, listen to advice and try to build something that's valuable, and then, hopefully good things happen.
Yeah. The time between Avalanche and Genascence, I don't want to belabor it too much, but let's take a sort of a brisk walk from Avalanche to the founding of Genascence.
Sure. So I left Avalanche in 2015, and it was following some disappointing clinical data, and it was a difficult time, for the company, because we were going to have to restructure, and I decided to, set down, bring in a new CEO, and I took a job with a brand new startup called Oncorus that Mitch Feiner and MPM and Deerfield were starting, and it was based in Boston. So spent most of my time in Boston for about a year and a half to get that off its feet, and that was a great experience. It was awesome to work in a different biotech market. We'd been in the Bay Area, to get to know the Boston ecosystem a little bit, and to work with some terrific investors and a great board and some really terrific operators as well. So that was always designed as temporary, because I wanted to move back to California, and so in 2016 came back, and since then really have been doing formation and seed investing, and this means starting companies, putting capital in the first couple $1 million, and really with the idea of, can we de-risk some of the key elements so that we can get to a place where it's really fundable at a bigger level. And so that really involved tech transfer from universities, designing some experiments that we thought could add a lot of value, and then building the rest of the story so we could go out and pitch it to later stage investors who are ready to fund later stage work. And so the first project that we did was Cyclus Vision, and this was founded right about that time, 2016. And it was, I had the great pleasure of working with Jay and Maureen Knights from the University of Washington, who had this terrific technology for myopia. And basically they had, developed this hypothesis about how myopia works. And they had even done a very early clinical test with kids wearing special glasses that could slow down the progression of myopia. And I thought, this is pretty interesting. Now, myopia, people really don't appreciate, I think, in the United States. It doesn't have quite the visibility, and sort of the market depth.
No pun intended on the visual.
Exactly. We're a little myopic here about myopia. But when you get into the field a little bit, you realize that this is an enormous problem in East Asia, in Singapore, in China, in Taiwan, in Japan, where almost everyone has nearsightedness. And 1 in 5 people, by the time they turn age 18, have severe nearsightedness that can lead to ocular complications and other kinds of retinal problems later in life. And so Cyclus Vision was a terrific project. My co-founder, Michael Furtick, came from the tech world, and we started this company together. We licensed the technology from University of Washington and built a company, ran a phase 3 trial, which was really successful, and ended up selling the company to CooperVision, who then spun it back out into a standalone joint venture with EssilorLuxottica. Product's been very successful and is selling, very well in China, and ultimately helping kids see better, which is so gratifying.
Yeah.
So really credit to Jay Knights and Maureen Knights and their team at University of Washington for sort of having the vision to create that product. After Cyclus, we've done a couple of more companies that are really in this formation, spirit of putting the first capital, transferring technology from the university to the company, building the company, and trying to get it through the initial stages. One has been Genascence, and we'll talk about that. The other is, as you mentioned in the introduction, a separate project for glaucoma coming out of Trinity College of Dublin, and so both of those have been major focuses for me for the last several years.
This the greater mission to apply gene therapy solutions to broad indications that are outside the realm of where gene therapies have lived for so long, in like ultra rare and rare diseases. Is that part of the I don't know, is that part of the thing that energizes you?
Yeah, it's really been a long-term interest and idea and hypothesis and hope that we could bring genetic medicines and gene therapy to major public health problems, right? So you think about gene therapy, well, it's like right in the name, gene therapy, genetic disease. And so a lot of people were sort of having this one-to-one correlation of gene replacement, genetic disease, Mendelian trait. This has been successful for a lot of companies, a lot of investors, and patients, but not a lot of patients, right? So because these areas are very severe, high unmet need, but tend to affect fairly modest patient populations. And so even going back to Avalanche, the idea was we know that this target is important, but delivery is a problem. So how can we get away from injections into the eye every 4 weeks for the rest of your life? Wouldn't it be nice to have something that lasts longer? And can gene therapy be used as a biofactory, if you will, to create the protein? We say, instead of making it, over in South San Francisco in a big bioreactor and then splitting it up into millions of patients' eye, can we inject something in one patient's eye and have those cells themselves make the therapeutic protein that continues to last? And so that's been a hypothesis for, a long time. And I think there was at first, I don't know if resistance, but just unfamiliarity with this idea, because gene therapy and genetic disease sort of went hand in hand. But as people started to think about, how we've learned so much about the manufacturing, the regulatory, the quality control, the immunology of these gene therapy vectors, how can we sort of leverage all of those tools into major diseases that affect a lot of people that still have very high unmet need? So certainly osteoarthritis is, leads that list. Drug delivery to the joints is very, very difficult. And recombinant proteins or small molecules, whether you inject them in the joint, they quickly leave the joint. If you inject them systemically, they really don't reach the joint in very high concentrations. And so how do we sort of flip that narrative into a local, long-lasting delivery following a single injection? And so, it was Anita Caravala, who's our co-founder at Genascence, who had become familiar with this project when she was at Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh, in graduate school, and sort of brought this idea of, we're interested in gene therapy for common diseases. Can we do this in joints for osteoarthritis? And so we, worked with Chris Evans, who had moved from Pittsburgh to the Mayo Clinic, and his other longtime collaborators, Paul Robbins and Steve Ghazzani, to take the technology that they'd worked on so long in terms of the molecular mechanisms of osteoarthritis into a commercial entity and be able to bring that forward in terms of real drug development.
Mm-hmm. Part of it came from the University of Florida as well? That's
right. So Steve Ghazzani had gone from, I mentioned Chris Evans went from Pitt to Mayo Clinic. His longtime postdoc went from Pitt to University of Florida and had, in large part, actually been attracted to be at Florida because the vet school has a very active equine research program. And so, it turns out that horses actually get naturally occurring osteoarthritis, which turns out to be the closest thing to the human disease that we see in the preclinical world. And so the ability to model that in horses and then and use that large animal model, and I think that's been a key success factor for gene therapies, is the ability to scale up in preclinically, so that then we can just scale over. And you think about the early experience in Leber's congenital amaurosis for Luxturna, or in with the hemophilia products, where those were proven out in large animal models before going clinical, and that was sort of the ability to really learn a lot with these preclinical models. So you weren't kind of scaling up and moving into humans at the same time. You were doing it sequentially, and I think that's been a key success factor for the field.
My quick aside here, my daughter had a show horse, a quarter horse, when she was very little, who developed, the mare developed osteoarthritis, and I took the horse to the Cleveland Equine Clinic and had images taken. And the veterinarian came out after taking the images and said, the good news is this horse's arthritis is so progressed that it doesn't know which leg to limp on. So you can't tell that she's limping half the time, and she's very safe for your daughter because she's not going to want to jump. So hey, you prompted that story.
No, that's exactly right. It's very common. Lameness in horses is a huge issue, and of course, it's a large weight-bearing joint, just like humans with hips and knees have large weight-bearing joints that, unfortunately, over time degenerate. Right? It's one of the most common degenerative diseases. It's just that it's local in one or more joints. As we age, and of course, brought about by, like many diseases of aging, complex etiology. But we think that by blocking interleukin-1, which is the lead inflammatory actor and also causes cartilage degeneration. In fact, the original name for it was catabolin because it catabolizes tissue. That by blocking this important central bad actor, that we can hopefully have an impact for patients.
When you take a genetic therapy to a common condition like osteoarthritis or glaucoma for that matter, do you face some of the same like logistics and distribution and supply chain challenges that the field has been struggling with for years now, or is the manufacturing and distribution paradigm somehow different?
So it's interesting. I think in some ways it's easier, and in some ways it's much harder because there are very different dynamics at play. So when you think about a systemic application of gene therapy, these are often dosed at 5 times 10 to the 14th vector genomes per kilogram, right? And so that could be doing the math. 1 times 10 to the 16th total vector genome particles. Right, or more. That's a lot of vector to manufacture, and the cost of doing that is very high. And these are rare diseases, so it's justifiable to charge high prices because you're having a huge impact on the patient's, health and outcomes and lifespan. And so all, whether it's a gene therapy or protein therapy, rare disease medications are, more expensive, right? But when you are thinking about bringing this forward to a very common disease, you face a totally different, pricing paradigm. You can't charge $3 million for a product in osteoarthritis, and you wouldn't want to. It would be completely economically, infeasible. And so the idea is, okay, if we want to charge, something that's, a 5-figure price tag instead of a 6 or 7-figure price tag, how do we go about doing that? Well, one of the things is that the cost of goods needs to be, in order to be a business, the cost of goods needs to be much lower. So, thinking about that, systemic doses and common diseases are currently, not workable because the systemic dose costs 6 figures to make. You can't sell it for 5 figures. That's not a business. But the diseases that we've worked on, whether they're ocular or whether they're intra-articular injection, are far lower doses, like 10,000-fold lower than a systemic administration. And that means that costs of goods are, very approachable if we scale in the right way, that we can get it down to the 4 figures or maybe the high 3 figures, right? In terms of the cost of making these therapies. So at the same time, I think we run into other sort of new challenges, right? So when you're charging a very high price for a drug, the way that these companies for rare diseases currently think about distribution is they work through distributors to kind of take orders, but oftentimes they ship directly, on dry ice or on liquid nitrogen to a tertiary academic medical center who has all the hospital pharmacy and facilities to be able to receive that, to store it for as long as they need, and then to administer it to the patient. And the several $1,000 cost of doing that shipment is inconsequential, right, to the price and the overall cost of the medicine. I think in common diseases, we're facing a very different kind of a dynamic where if we're trying to make it and deliver it to the patient for, $1,000, a $2,000 shipping cost is completely impossible and infeasible, right? So what that means is that, we need to do this through sort of a traditional distribution pathway like biologics, like Lucentis, which I worked on at Genentech, are distributed today. And the cost of doing that is, much more into the unit economics. But that being said, we don't expect that every single, just as an example, every single clinic will have a minus 80 degree freezer. And so, generating the kind of stability data that will let us, that's compatible with distributions to every single clinic, not just tertiary academic medical centers. So these are, just some examples of some of the challenges that, we've faced and then, are overcoming or have overcome on the way to, delivering on the promise for gene therapy for common diseases.
Our friends at Alston & Bird set us up with some amazing space to record during JPM week. The firm's national healthcare and life sciences practice has more than 100 attorneys actively involved in the healthcare industry across the full spectrum of legal disciplines. The signature strength of this practice is its ability to master complex representations that draw on the coordinated expertise of its regulatory, compliance, public policy, transactional, corporate governance, securities, FDA, biotech, IP, government investigations, and litigation practice areas. Alston & Bird represents life sciences companies and their partners in corporate stages, ranging from private to newly public to well-established, and in a variety of stages of product development from preclinical to post-approval commercial launch. Learn more at alston.com and tell them you learned about them on the Business of Biotech. The regulatory paradigm occurs to me that there's got to be a challenge there too, like regulatory bodies that are evaluating or prosecuting genetic therapies for rare disease, ultra rare disease. I'm assuming tend to be a little bit more liberal than someone who comes along and says, hey, we're developing a gene therapy that for an indication that has a giant patient population. I can imagine the agencies would be like, all right, let's pump the brakes here a little bit. Like this is a modality that we haven't necessarily seen a lot of broad patient population applicability.
Well, so, yes and no. So, you think about rare diseases and the bar is, I don't want to say necessarily lower, but certainly it's infeasible to run multiple large trials in rare diseases because there aren't enough patients to recruit or find or treat.
Yeah.
And so the risk of mass exposure to huge populations isn't there, right? And so the idea of a rare safety event, becoming a major public health problem just doesn't really exist. And so that framework for rare diseases is, sort of over here, right? Mm-hmm. The framework for common diseases has existed for a long time, with small molecules, with biologics, et cetera. And it is feasible to do, large studies, and it is certainly, going to be used in large populations. So yes, FDA and EMA and other regulatory agencies want you to characterize those, the safety profile. In other words, those adverse events.
Yeah.
And, but to say that products like this haven't been used in those populations, that's not quite right. When we think about what was the first gene therapy, it was probably the polio vaccine, right? Back, and this is given to millions of healthy people, including kids. And so the bar for vaccines being, very broadly distributed and in healthy people rather than sick patients is very, very high, right? And probably rightly so.
Yeah.
And so I think probably the gene therapy for common diseases is somewhere in between. These are sick patients, but it's a large population, so of course we have to go characterize them. I think, of course, it's, the office is the office of OTP within CBER, has their own way of doing things that's separate from the device division and separate from the drugs division. And so, we're in the process at Genascence of going to talk to the agency this year about phase 2 design and sort of future development program. And so I think we'll learn more. There are phase 3 programs that are, in large indications, for example, for macular degeneration, and we're, entering phase 2. So we're going to learn more and more about how regulatory agencies are thinking about these in common diseases. But the framework is sort of, already laid out by vaccines and by other major indications, where biologics and small molecules have gone before us.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of how large your phase 2 will be?
So the phase 2 for Genascence is really going to be designed to provide clinical proof of concept. So that's a pain and function study.
Okay.
And we'll also look at structural endpoints. So we'll look at MRIs of how the joints are doing. And so we think that's going to be about 250 patients in this phase 2. So certainly not tiny, but certainly not huge either. I think you certainly can study in a well-designed pain trial. You can certainly see clinical symptom improvement in osteoarthritis patients with OA of the knee.
What, as you're talking to investors and you're gearing up to launch a clinical trial, what do you see in terms of the financing environment? And I guess what questions do you get from investors when you're telling them we're developing a gene therapy for an indication like osteoarthritis for the knee?
Well, certainly from an investment perspective, these last 2 to 3 years have not been what the previous 7 or 8 years were, right? And I think everybody recognizes that the investors are becoming more selective. The market's been down, interest rates have been high, whatever the sort of drivers of the market have been. It's been more difficult to finance companies privately. It's been more difficult to do IPOs, and prices, and valuations are down, right? And so I see that as an investor, and of course, as an operator and entrepreneur as well. I think investment groups are different, right? And they all have different theses and that's wonderful because they have different ideas of what the future holds. And some investors are going to say, osteoarthritis, not for me, it's a very difficult area. And some are going to say, wow, this is the biggest opportunity in all of biotech, right? Why? Because when you're putting together, a huge patient population, right? 32 million Americans with osteoarthritis, 1.2 million new cases of knee osteoarthritis every year. Huge unmet, huge patient population together with a massive unmet need. There are no therapies, right? All we have is pain control and sort of temporary, symptomatology. Nothing really treats the underlying disease. And so these two things together, really drive an enormous opportunity space. And so that's what got us excited of, hey, people have been trying to block this target for a long time. No one's been successful. We think we can do this with gene therapy. And now with the latest clinical data we've shown, we can express, this at the target levels in these patients' joints for the long term. So, what's next? Okay, we need to run a proper phase 2 to really show the value of it.
From your seat as CEO, and then also from an investor perspective, are you optimistic this year about public markets, about cash coming into biotech? What's your read on 2025?
I think it's too soon to tell. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of chatter in the hallways. This week, JPM Healthcare Week in San Francisco about is 2025 looking more optimistic? I think that was the headline this morning. That sort of deal announcements have driven sort of a more upbeat tenor. I've heard other people say this feels a lot like 2023 and 2024. So I don't know. I won't look into my crystal ball too hard. I'm sort of certainly hopeful that inflation coming down, perhaps interest rates coming down, and the market's sort of back to normalizing and rewarding innovation. Certainly hope for that on all of our behalf, right? Is in the biotech industry. That 2025 will be a great year.
You mentioned you're talking about the investment community and the different appetites among different investors just a few minutes ago. And it seems to me that when things are tight and tough, like the company you keep becomes all the more important, finding those investors who do get excited about an opportunity like this. So this is a broad question, but what advice would you give a biotech builder on turning over the right rocks to find an investment partner, tough times or otherwise, right? Because you don't want the wrong investors either when things are flush, when there's money to be had. So what advice do you offer around finding the right investor for your specific approach?
I guess this is a great question. There's a few things I'd say. One is that you never really know who your investors are going to be, and you can hypothesize that there's a great strategic fit for this fund or this company. And I find that very rarely is that have a strong predictive value, right? what you think someone should be interested in, doesn't necessarily correlate to what their internal discussions, are mapping out the strategy for that company or that fund. Therefore, you really don't know what meetings are going to be useful. So take meetings, because you may learn something, you may get an introduction, something may surprise you. Another thing is that, it's easier if investors declare themselves, right? And so getting out there at academic conferences to talk about your science, putting press releases out to say, here's where we are, sort of being open about and broadcasting, this is where we are and kind of what we're working on and what we hope to do, actually will help investors who are interested declare themselves. And that's easier than, reaching out to, hundreds or thousands of different funds. And so sometimes that's a good strategy. I'd say, in terms of, who are the right investor partners, in my experience, it's very hard to predict. Going in and sort of just by the tenor of the conversations, what those relationships are going to be like, 4 years down the road when things get tough, right? That's actually quite hard to predict. But it is possible to align incentives to some extent and sort of pick investors who are going to share incentives. So if you have a long-term, strategy and you need investors that are going to be there for a while, pick someone who has that long-term mindset that can be patient capital, that's not going to want you to, do an IPO in 6 months, right? Mm-hmm. I think it's possible to sort of align those incentives. Obviously, people's reputation, talk to other companies that they've worked with in the past and sort of get a read on, what was this investor like when things were going great? What were they like when things were going not so great? How helpful were they in terms of, helping you overcome your challenges? And so, certainly those are all helpful. And look, it's kind of fancy to prognosticate and say, oh, this is exactly the type of investor that I would, want to have in this company. But at the end of the day, like, you have to eat the food that's on the table. Yeah. And so, if every company were so lucky that, we have, 20 different, sets of opportunities to choose from, and you can optimize who you want to work with, like, wow, amazing, that's wonderful. In my experience, that's not every time. Yeah. Right? That's a little bit of a rare moment, or a rare company. And so, often a deal's available, and that's the one you're going to do. And I think, most entrepreneurs will realize, that's kind of the realpolitik of, biotech entrepreneurship and early stage raising capital.
I like the use of the word fancy there. So it's kind of fancy. Let's not get too fancy, right?
I have a similarly broad question that I wanted to ask based on something you said earlier. I think you got to know the Boston area ecosystem through Oncorus, and you mentioned you wanted to come back to San Francisco. What do you like or dislike? I guess, how would you compare Boston and California for, a biotech company that's looking for funding or that's, doing science? Which do you like better and why? I'm
gonna jump in before he responds. He's a native California. He's a Menlo Park guy, so he's probably going to give you a biased response.
No,
just like you had to work University of Florida into your question earlier. Ben's an Orlando guy, so he was giving a shout out to the home state there.
Well, I mean, so you're of course you're absolutely right. So I'm from California. I'm from Menlo Park originally, and sort of it's changed a lot in the last 40 plus years, but. Being from here, I think the biotech ecosystem was more mature faster in California than it was in Boston, because you had Genentech and you had sort of companies that had grown all the way up from startups to commercial, large pharma commercial entities, right? And that was certainly true, 10, 15 years ago, probably more true here than it was in Boston. When we were kind of getting, around the time we were getting Oncorus started. But look, the Boston ecosystem has just grown so enormously with big pharma setting up shop there, with university collaborations. And one of the delights about being in Boston is that it's all extremely concentrated in kind of Kendall Square area. And then of course you have, other businesses that are out in Waltham and other areas. But there's such a vibrant biotech community, in Boston. At the same time, Palo Alto still has such an amazing entrepreneurial ecosystem and vibe. And I think, one of the I was asking you, in the elevator ride up, if you watch the HBO show Silicon Valley, because it's this just incredible sort of art imitating life parody of Silicon Valley, and you watch that show, living here, and you recognize all these patterns, right? And there's a real joy to being an entrepreneur in this area, because the ecosystem is so rich in terms of all the supporting elements, but also because I think people are really sort of culturally rewarded for taking risks, and rewarded for thinking big and thinking bold and being brave, and so that's we're incredibly lucky right here in the Bay Area and in Silicon Valley to be part of a culture that says, yeah, that's possible. Let's dream about a world where that could be true.
Does Silicon Valley have the tech bio leg up on biotech in Boston? Like, do you see a differentiation there in terms of the approach?
I mean, perhaps because there's so much, technology and AI and so many engineers here, and so many tech investors are in this area. So you do see a lot of things happening here, and every wave of the newest thing sort of seems to always be in San Francisco and Silicon Valley. At the same time, I mean, of course, you have incredible computer scientists coming into MIT and Harvard and in Boston as well, and so I do see a lot of kind of research and platform companies coming out of the Boston area that are just absolutely tremendously innovative.
Yeah, I haven't seen the statistics for 2024, but I know for a number of years running, Boston has held the top title for NIH grants. So the NIH science grants, for
you have MIT, you have Harvard, you have all the hospitals there as well. So it's tremendous ecosystem, and in the Bay Area it's big, but it's awfully spread out. So I think that's if you talk to employees, they're probably frustrated by the long commutes in the Bay Area versus jumping on the red line, to go to Kendall Square.
I noticed coming up 101 from the airport, and I didn't remember this, and maybe it was cloudy the last few times I've been through, but there are a ton of big pharma buildings right there, in South San Francisco. Is that newer, or have they had shops there for a while?
Well, Genentech certainly has for a long time, and then I think through acquisitions, others have built presences there as well.
Merck, AbbVie, big name companies, with their names on top of big buildings along 101 there.
Yeah. Let's reel it back into Genascence and get a little bit of a sense for where you are right now and what the next significant inflection points might look like.
Sure. So Genascence, as I mentioned, is developing a product for osteoarthritis that blocks interleukin-1, which is the major bad actor. And this is responsible for pain and inflammation, but also for cartilage degeneration. And so the initial first-in-human study was run by Chris Evans at Mayo Clinic, and this was back in approximately 2022. And then Genascence was spun that technology out and completed our Series A, and then we got a CIRM grant from the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine, and those two financings together allowed us to progress into the next stage, which was a phase 1B clinical study. So we call it Donatello, in keeping with the Renaissance theme of Genascence. And the idea, there were a couple objectives. One was it was dose ranging with and without immune conditioning, because so many gene therapy protocols have some kind of immune conditioning, whether it's with steroids or biologics, to see if you can improve safety and efficacy of the gene therapy by modulating the immune system. So nobody had tried this in the joint before, so we were quite innovative, thinking about, is there a role here for immunosuppression? We didn't have any in the phase 1, the first in man at Mayo Clinic. Should we bring that forward to the phase 1B and test whether whether we can get any insights? And so we started that study. Let's think about this, in 2023, and began enrollment toward the end of 2023. We completed enrollment, and now we finished the 6-month follow-up. We announced the data from that follow-up just last week, leading up to JPM. So that was 6-month data, and the conclusions are, really it was safe across all doses tested, and regardless with and without the immune conditioning, and whether that immune conditioning was a short course of oral steroids or whether it was a very brief course of oral with an intra-articular injection of steroids. And so it was well tolerated across all of those cohorts. And importantly, in multiple groups, we saw an increase in the transgene, which is interleukin-1 receptor antagonist, to our target levels in the synovial fluid, so inside the knee joints of these patients. So throughout, we were sampling the synovial fluid from the patients to test that in a qualified clinical assay. Are we seeing, levels of the transgene, the IL-1RA, increase? And the answer was yes, it was getting target levels and it's lasting 6 months. So that's terrific news. So now we know we can, have the pharmacodynamic effect that we're looking for. And, what's next is to say, okay, we know we can intervene in this pathway. It's been a long-standing hypothesis that interleukin-1 is important in OA symptoms and disease progression. Now can we bring that forward into a proper clinical proof of concept study, looking at pain and function, and starting to look at joint structure to see, do patients improve symptomatically, and can that last long term following a single injection? And what's happening? Start to ask the question as an exploratory endpoint: what's happening to the joints of these patients over time? Are they actually improving in terms of inflammation? And are we seeing a trend toward improvement in cartilage and other markers of disease progression of MRI? So we launched a Series B to try to fund that study. Mm-hmm. And so, very, very in the early stages of that. And so, hopefully we'll get some good feedback from investors in the coming weeks. We also have a plan to go talk to FDA about what's next.
Yeah, which that's a beautiful segue into what you're doing here this week. Like, specifically what you're doing here this week. We all know what we're doing here this week. What are you doing specifically here this week to perhaps contribute to that Series B?
Certainly doing a lot of walking around, but at least it's not raining or hailing this year, which is an improvement on the last couple of years.
The sunshine has been more than welcome.
So, certainly spending time with investors, but I would say, a lot of investors these days tend to want to meet outside of this week because they're so busy with, portfolio companies. So most of our, investor meetings are sort of next week and the following week. We also like to use this week as an opportunity to talk to strategic partners that, may be more diffuse in the ecosystem, coming from Europe or coming from, different parts of the US, and also to catch up with, folks who have been following our story to kind of give them an update. So a little bit of everything and more to come.
Yeah, excellent. Well, it's a great place to be doing a little bit of everything and working towards that more to come.
Indeed.
And like I said, I know this is an incredibly busy week for you, so I appreciate you spending at least a small chunk of it with us.
Absolutely. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.